Buonasera a tutti, cominciamo così alle 7, così verso le 8 abbiamo finito. Io sono uno dei docenti, diciamo, del Miaw di quest'anno e mi fa molto piacere presentare Guenther Vogt, che è un mio ottimo amico e che è un architetto del paesaggio con il suo studio principale a Zurigo. In italiano o in inglese? In English, okay. So his main office is in Zurich, in Switzerland. He is, I think, a rather unusual landscape architect. First of all, because he's interested in architecture, and but also because he's interested in a variety of things which go from things which are very large to things which are very small. And I think this is something very important for all of us to understand, that scale is a fundamental aspect of our profession. And in fact, the studio work we did with him this afternoon was constantly about trying to understand the big city as a whole and our position both as designers and as citizens of this wider interpretation of the metropolitan city. So his talk this evening will largely focus on a project in London and on a special kind of concept, an urban metropolitan concept of what the Alps are. The Alps are the center of Europe in a way, but they're also a park which is located in a much wider metropolitan area. And for the students who are working on the Lambro, it's very important to understand that the Lambro originates in the Alps, and so that there is a physical connection between Milano and the Alps. So I will let him start, and we will have 15-20 minutes at the end of this talk for a shorter discussion. Thank you.
Okay. Good evening. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for... Okay, again, good evening. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for inviting me. What I would like to show you, of course, I have different projects in the office, but as a landscape architect, it's very important what is your biographical background. So for you as architects, it's much easier to work in China, in the Middle East, in Russia, wherever. For a landscape architect, it's not only the different trees, it's a different climate, and it's a different culture. So today, the worldwide architecture is much more rooted on a common understanding what architecture is. So, I mean, high-risers looking in London the same as in Singapore, but landscape is different. And for me, to talk with architectural students, it's also coming from this background of the Alps. But then we are, of course, planning this kind of landscapes where you have tropical vegetation. That was a project for the zoo in Zurich, an ecosystem hall about the rainforest in Mazoala in Madagascar, where we imported all these tropical plants. Then here, for instance, a small courtyard in Zurich where we got a prize from a Natural Conservation Society, but they didn't realize that here is a car parking underneath, and there's only 80 centimeters of soil for this birch tree. So they didn't realize it's super artificial. It's only the image looks like nature. And here again, it's for the FIFA, for the World Football Club Association. They wanted to have different vegetation from all 5 continents. So in this courtyard, we propose the Northern American rainforest, where it can have frost and very cold. And of course, people really believe that this stem, 3 meters wide, is really nature. but they have park underneath. You don't realize they don't bring the architecture together with their own car parking place. So it's out of concrete and it's super artificial. But I know many people working there for 5 years, they still believe that these trunks are real. And the same, if you work, I will show afterwards a project in London. If you work in England, or let's say in London, London is a rich city in a poor country. So, but it's completely different to all the other countries in Europe. Where we did in front of the Tate Gallery, the transformation of a former industrial area into an open plaza, but it wasn't possible to have a mineral plaza, like you know it from the Mediterranean. That's just not possible. So the English have an erotic relationship to grass, so they need really grass to sit on. So, and they don't like to have trees in lines or this kind of orthogonal grid trees, so it always have to look natural. So this was the compromise we did. So it looks like what you would expect on an abandoned industrial landscape, birch trees, and it's along the River Thames. So that was a compromise to fit into this culture of nature. It's the same in London with Herzog & de Meuron again. Completely artificial landscape. We were not allowed.
Talk a bit louder.
Yeah. So we were. Let's go a bit. There. So we were not allowed to take the soil away. So we had to keep it. It's super polluted, and we were not allowed to plant a tree because there is a very rare bird species living here. And then, if you would plant trees, these big crows would attack the small bird. It's only topography related to the building, related to the usage of the building. So it's like an auditorium because it's a Laban dance theater where people can stay outside having picnic and for performances. Then the stadium in Munich, again, it's a huge landscape. It looks like a huge landscape, but we have 12,000 car parking spaces underneath. And that was this collaboration with architecture here again with Herzog & de Meuron. They, besides the stadiums, they were planned to have 4 car parking buildings for 3,000 car parks, every building. And I said it's just not possible to have in front of such a cathedral buildings in the same scale, so we should really keep it under the level of the motorway, so you cannot see buildings just near such a cathedral of sport of today. So the last one, transformation again of a former industrial area, harbor in Bremen in northern Germany with completely black concrete. And again, if I'm talking about scale and time, it looks like nature. It's a park in Basel. It's again, as always in Switzerland, it's on top of a car parking. And it looks like nature, but this photo is half a year after building this park. And of course, it's not nature. It only looks like nature. It's along the River Rhine. So it's a kind of artificial natural landscape. And here as well, so compromise with Secima on the same campus in Basel. So Secima wanted to have this kind of light concrete, gray concrete, and the boss of the company wanted to have a Japanese small river going through with bonsai trees. And that was the compromise, to have an exact landscape out of limestones, different depths. So from above, it's you see here, it's different in depth. So it looks like a specific landscape, and you can only walk through when you look carefully where you can walk. Otherwise, you are in the water, or you stand and it can look like that. It has a lot to do with perception in this super reduced architecture. And the transformation in Basel again, a former cemetery into a public park. So you see our project, there is really a wide range of different aspects, how to deal with nature in a dense urban situation. So and we always have to find a new program, and that's, I think, really the difference between architecture and landscape architect, and this question of scale, where I will come to later on. For me, it's, this is one of the most important, you know it, this painting where you still have the old city and the landscape. And so you can see all this production of agricultural production, trade going through, and then it's brought to the city, and the wall in between the landscape and the city. But today, I think it's completely different. That's the situation in Zurich, where I live and where our office is here, where you have two rivers coming in, one from the lake, and you can see after a heavy rain, 2 days later, this river is coming, crossing the railway station underneath, but coming from the landscape. So it's completely muddy, brown, and here it's completely clean. So where you really see this influence of the landscape and the city in the same river. You have a similar situation in Lyon, in France, where you have in the city center this explanation how a city relates to the surrounding landscape. Now when I'm talking about scale, I would like to talk about the Alps. So where we are interested in is the perception of the Alps was in the past, and it's not so long ago, a very a distant perception. Especially the Swiss had a specific relationship to the Alps. So they feared to go there, and then later on it became a sublime landscape through these German or English romantic painters. And in a way, the Swiss Alps are a British idea again. So where you see the London Alpine Club still today, British people in Switzerland have to be in the board of this Alpine Club. So this transformation of perception, so the Alps are no longer dangerous. And then what the English brought in was a different scale. So here in Engadin, in St. Moritz, an English landscape park in the Alps. So this, again, this play with the different scales in a landscape and in relation to the landscape. And I think especially in Switzerland, this relationship to this supernature Alps is important. And today, as you know, it's a completely new approach to how we use and how we see. It's in a way, it became in the last 50 years an industrial landscape. Invisible sometimes, but very visible in other times of the scale. So of course you relate as well to the Alps. So this is the red line is showing the official border of the Alps with 7 different European countries. And when Sebastiano is saying somehow the Alps are in the center of Europe, that was before 1989. Today you can say it's in the center of Western Europe, because the center of Europe is even further east than Berlin. It's somewhere in Bulgaria. That's the real center of today's Europe. So this is the center of Western Europe since 25 years. And when we look at, and we are interested, because it's in a way our environment, it's our culture, and the ETH Studio Basel, Herzog and de Meuron, Marcel Meili and Roger Diener made a research about the urbanization in Switzerland, saying that the Alps are finally an abandoned landscape. And of course, all these famous architects we have in the Alps, they were all shouting and crying, no, we are not in an abandoned landscape. We live there, we work there. But in a way, when you look closer, you see here, for instance, all the parks, or in Switzerland, all the different parks is being established in the last 100 years. So the first one was the national park in Engadin, and since then we have different regional, local UNESCO parks, and overlapping the abandonment of the landscape. So the Alps here, and the Jura here, and the Mittelland in between. And for us, it's really, we have this problem of abandonment all over Europe, and you should know it in Italy as well. It's very strong. And here in Spain, Portugal, France, this abandoned landscape, and through Germany, you can really see the former situation of the wall, where it's becoming completely abandoned. And that's a problem that landscape architects don't see it as a problem. I see it as a problem. I was with Sebastiano close to Genoa, where you can find villages completely abandoned, but you have signage saying this is private land. Is it meaning you can build there, or you could build there in the future? And we have to have an idea how to deal with this new type of landscape, and it's massive. The surface of this abandoned landscape. And when I was a student, or in your age, everybody told me, yeah, you know, the Waldsterben, we were on the streets, and then 2015, we will have 50% less forests than when I was a student. The reality is just the opposite. The growth of forests all over Europe is so strong in the last 20 years. And it has to do, of course, with this situation 1989, where all this coal mining, this coal production in Eastern Europe was stopped. So all this pollution was stopped one day, nearly one day to the other. So forest is growing like crazy. When I go to Tuscany, when I was in your age, in Tuscany was really, you know, completely different landscape as it is today. And that's interesting to compare. It's like Lake District in London. That's, again, an English idea from when they were in Italy, the English, they saw Tuscany, and they thought we have to find something in England similar to it, and it was the Lake District. Then it was a very poor countryside, but then they transformed it somehow, and today it looks, at least for the English, it looks like Tuscany. And this transfer of landscape is for me interesting, and it's happening today as well. As I had this discussion with the students this afternoon, where you can see in the metropolitan area of Milan, you have new type of parks. And for me, and Sebastiano introduced me years ago to see what's going on. It's in the metropolitan areas of Milan. It's not in the northern part of Europe. No landscape architect knows it really, and it's not spectacular like a traditional park, but for me it's super interesting because it's a new type of park, and it's not so designed, but it's more about social processes, different processes. So when I'm saying it's of course it's becoming abandoned land somehow, but you have all these big cities in here, Ljubljana, Vienna, Munich, Zurich, Milan, Turin, Marseille, Lyon. So for all these, that's a bit our theory, for all these cities, they are all outside the Alps. It's a bit like the central part for them. And you know it from here, so going for skiing, for whatever you do, walking, that's the future of the Alps will be like that. And of course, you have different situations, like Lyon is similar to Milan. But when you look at Zurich, so for instance, from Geneva to Zurich, it's like here in the metropolitan area, it's not one center, it's polycentric. And that changes the situation to work in completely. So for instance, when we go closer, you see it's heavy. The infrastructure in here is really dense, and you can get to every point in the Mittelland as very fast. But that's one problem. That the big cities like Geneva and Zurich are growing, and it's becoming a political problem because only Geneva and Zurich are growing. Even Basel has problem to grow and to be in concurrence to these big cities. And going closer in Zurich, for instance, the problem is when I talk with my colleagues, the architects at ETH, about the Alps as abandoned landscape, of course we then have critical discussions, but the reality in Switzerland is here Zurich, with the lake of Zurich, and you see it's becoming denser and denser. We still have so-called forests, but for me, these forests are not really forests, because the footpath system is as dense as in the Central Park in New York. But you see, the biggest political problem is that all these villages can decide themselves what kind of landscape, what kind of urban situations they have. So these independent municipal boundaries makes it a huge problem, that you cannot think regional, you always think local. And that makes it really problematic. So for instance, that you have a forest going along the city of Zurich on both sides, and our students made interviews with the people living around these forests, and believe me, for you it would be a park, but people living there, they don't perceive it today as a park, because for them it's still landscape. And that's a real problem, that if they say landscape, they have to go by car or by train at least 1 hour into the Alps. That's nature or landscape, but it cannot be as close as here to a city. And that's perception of people. You cannot change it and say, now it's a park. You have to live it. There is a difference between built space and perceived space. And especially in Switzerland, people are not interested to live in an urban situation. I would even say Swiss people hate cities. So they wouldn't like the center of Milan, they only like it as tourists. They wouldn't like to live there because it's too dense, it's too urban for them. But as tourists, it's nice. So, because I don't have enough time, I have to go through here. It's a traditional park I wanted to show you in Hamburg, in this transformation of the Hafen city. But I show then afterwards in this project in London. Again, for the students for this afternoon, we always build huge model. And for this park in Hamburg, we built this model was about 8 or 10 meters long. We always design directly from the beginning in the model. Even without having an idea, we can use it, of course, for instead of rendering, we use these photos to explain our project. Go quite fast through. We just started to build it, and of course, again, different scales. There is a Jewish memorial we have to build there. That's the history where Jewish people were transported to Auschwitz, and then we just build authentic landscape. Then, not interesting, now we go fast to the next project. And of course, we always relate to a history of a city here to Hamburg, and Hamburg is really a brick town, and we designed our own brick, and that's the first wall. So, now in London. London is in a way like Milan, but the opposite. London really grew from a center from Roman times into the landscape, and one day they established this so-called green belt, and you can still see it today from that London is really a city in a landscape, and the border is a system, a very large system of parks, I would say, similar to the parks in the metropolitan region in Milan. And our project is here. Here is Heathrow. Today it's a farm, and we will transform it into a park. And the problem is when I'm saying you have different cultures and different understanding of nature. And in London, it's very special, or in England, it's very special because Margaret Thatcher said, when was it, early 80s, we don't need urban planners or architects doing urban planning, so we don't need people working for the government in the urban planning because the free market will sort out all these problems. And so today, it's just not possible to find an affordable apartment in the center of London. People, meanwhile, are traveling 2 hours one way, so that means 4 hours every day by train to come into the city center. And that's the liberal market cannot sort out this problem. When we started here, for instance, we were asked by a private investor doing this. We couldn't find any information. So we couldn't find out, do they need a sports ground or do they need a children playground, anything. So we had to ask the people ourselves as part of our job to find out what is the right program for this park, because nobody was, so how it looks today. So I asked a woman living here, she didn't know that there will be a huge park built. And we were asked, it was a direct contract, not a competition. And they asked us because they told me that we in Switzerland, we have so many car parking spaces and on top it's green, and here it will be the same because it will be a gravel pit, and the owner promised to the people living around that it will be from the beginning a park. But for the next 25 years, they will dig out gravel. And you see what we did in our research, and I only show a little bit of our research. So in a way, it's here, our site, and it's like a section through here where you have traditional park like Greenwich Park, Hyde Park, Regent's Park, so this kind of traditional urban parks on one hand. So, and it's, you can compare it, so that's our site. So with the traditional parks you can find everywhere in London. And this is the green belt. So I mean, there is our site, and this is the green belt, the real boundary around London. And the traditional parks, neighborhood parks, small farms, and so on. So that's the whole green system in London. And when I'm talking about scale, for us it was important, what is the right scale? And we wanted to have it related to the green belt, to the big scale, and to the local scale. So, and why is it so important? You see the geological map. You can dig out gravel. And in the perception of a Londoner, they still have in mind, and I imagine everybody of you have been in London, they read their own city in different types of landscape. And you know, for me, coming from Switzerland, London is flat and it's dense and it's urbanized. But in the perception of a typical Londoner, there is still underlaid a specific landscape type. So we did a research. We walked in this green belt. We always do extensive field trips when we start such a project. And when you know the metropolitan area in Milan, it's a bit like that. So it's not always clear, is it now a park or is it landscape? That these are parts in this green belt system. And then, of course, we had to provide something, and then I said it's not possible to design such a park, and it's stupid to make a competition, because we have to be the leader of different processes. One is the political process, social process. You have to organize so many trees, so the vegetation has to be organized, and you can imagine to organize all this soil to be transported away from here, and the water, and so on. So we started to make like a program, not a design. And we found out really through interviews and not the local government what people are interested to have in their park, in a way to say, okay, this we found then out, and here it should be a neighborhood park, it should be a local park, and here it could become part of this green belt system where you still have production, agriculture, nurseries, and so on. And it relates to the green belt, whole London, and this part is a neighborhood part, a small scale park. And that's today a problem with many competitions we are doing. We never get a real program. You as architects, you normally get a really good program. So you have to have such an auditorium, so many toilets, a foyer, whatever. In landscape architecture, there is not always a real problem, or mainly there is no program. And so don't take it as a design. We worked with young architects and Arabs, engineers. How can we build this park? And now you see what will happen. So we will take the soil away and then drill holes in it, fill it with concrete, and then a concrete slab on top, and then refill the soil and then build the park. This will take about 1 year, and then we will have a park on top on concrete, and then they will dig out for 25, 30 years all the soil underneath. And you can imagine that quite a difficult thing to organize. How can you use this space? And to give you an idea, this is the biggest space in Europe. It's Amazon storage space near London, and it will be 10 times bigger, all our spaces, and the biggest, largest existing space. And of course, you can imagine, how can you, in an economic sense, calculate what happens within 25 or 30 years? So there is a discussion now, a server farm, or the Secret Service, the data, because near an airport you have a lot of military, police, and so on. So it's well protected, so we could have very delicate data stored here. But then there was a discussion whether Heathrow will still be there, or they build a new airport in the southeast, a much larger airport. They would close Heathrow, and then within half a year, the economic situation changes completely. And that's not so easy to calculate besides a real project. And we propose to have it for the neighborhood, people living in the neighborhood. They really understand and see how their park grows through nurseries, so the production of trees we would like to have directly on site. And of course, in the public discussion, we have to show something, and then it looks like design, but we don't read it as design. We only had to organize how big are the caves underneath, and where we can plant real trees with real soil, and where is it on the top of a car parking. And of course, I'm not talking about the whole water management. The groundwater has to flow through underneath. And so that's how it looks like. Finally, here, Heathrow Airport, and this is the new park in the future. And that's a bit the problem for my young colleagues in the office, that they have to draw something, and I'm saying it's not a real design. We will start next January or February to really design it, because we got now the planning permission, and we can really plan it and design it. And now the real design process will start. And that's the last images. That's why I'm talking about scale. And I think for my students, for instance, coming to Milan, for them it was coming from the clean Switzerland, it's all well organized. They couldn't understand what is a metropolitan area like Greater Milan, how does it work? Because they were so confused with all this traffic and all this really strange infrastructure. But coming from Switzerland, it's easy. But my problem is when I'm in Chile, for instance, I was last year in Chile. Everywhere where I'm coming in the world, there is a completely new scale in terms of landscape. For instance, the new minings in Chile are so big that you really think you are on the moon. And that's what because it's very close. When we are talking, we were with the students a week in Istanbul, and we explained them also the importance cultural importance of Istanbul, how a city works, and then we showed how could they bring so much drinking water into the city center of Istanbul. So we looked at the historical aqueduct and explained them how drinking water was brought in, and wonderful architecture by the architect Sinan, and explained them how a city historically and today works. And by accident, we found then out, so, and finally, of course, we showed them the religious aspect of water. But in the end, we found out that Istanbul is planning a second Bosporus. This is the existing, and then somebody explained that there is a second Bosporus. They will destroy here, this is the most important park in Istanbul. It's a forest or a picnic area, but on the weekends, people living in the center of Istanbul, they go into this forest and have picnics there, because you can see there is not really a park in the center of Istanbul. So they will cut off this, and then you go deeper, and you find out this is the official map. It's not only one Bosporus, there are two Bosporus going exactly through here, where this most important metropolitan park in a way is. And of course here is planned the biggest airport of the world. 8 parallel landing runways. 8, can you imagine? 8 in parallel. It's a completely new scale. It's completely over the scale of this landscape. And the ecological impact to connect this sea with this sea is, you can just not control it. But we are doing things like we didn't learn from Chernobyl or Fukushima. We are still doing this really unbelievable things we are not controlling. I think we really lost control, because we are doing and thinking things we are not controlling, and we really build it. And that's, for me, that's why this idea of scale, we have it on the level of a city like Milan or London, but we have it on this big scale as well. So that's why I'm happy to work in a small scale. It's just an actual exhibition we are doing in New York, where you have this most beautiful skyline. We installed a garden here together with Dan Graham, instead of this skyline and in the background, in the middle ground, the most beautiful park. But then you stay in a garden, so where you really control it. And it's really nice when you stay in a garden, you have this beautiful urban park, and then this skyline of a really metropolitan, and of course there's all this stand mirroring itself, and people are so fascinated because it relates to their body, it relates to their perceptions. They understand the big scale of a city because they can control something, and that's why I'm constantly talking about scale and the difference between perceived spaces and built spaces. So, now we can have a discussion.
Very punctual.
Yes.
Well, thank you to Guenther for. Thank you to Guenther for this fast excursion. I think that also to involve the other professors and the students, of course. I would like to concentrate on Milano, of which Guenther has said something. And my first question would be not about metropolitan Milano, but when I started teaching, when Guenther invited me to join him and teach with him in Zurich 6 years ago, I was very surprised to understand what the perception which Swiss people have about the architecture in Milan. I think we Italians in general are very good about, not being very proud of ourselves and always saying negative things about Italian society and Italian environment. And so I would like Guenther to start by saying, why Swiss people consider Milano to be an exceptional town.
I think Swiss people only come to Italy as tourists, and even architects, they only come as tourists. And that's my problem, that I will never forget that one of my students did in front of the Colosseum with a mobile phone a photo with flashlight, because it was late in the afternoon, and I freaked really out. Say, hey, you are an architect, you are not a tourist. You are always an architect, and especially in front of the Colosseum. It's just not possible that you act as an architect like that. But when we were here 2 weeks ago with our students, they visited 10 buildings on Saturday because it was a free day for them, and it was all from modernity, all the famous name you know. Only in the center of Milan, not outside. When we brought them outside, for them it was a shock to understand and to see how a real city works, and to find out that even with our good guides, we lost ourselves in this metropolitan situation. For them it was a shock, because Switzerland is like a garden with a traffic garden. You never get lost in Switzerland, it's just not possible. But here our students lost the overview, and even my colleagues or the good architects in Switzerland, they only have this perception. I think it stopped when Aldo Rossi came to the ETH, and afterwards it's no longer existing Italian architecture, and it's only the modernist period, and it's a super touristic view on a country, and that's a pity, because when we came down from Como on the motorway, Sebastiano mentioned, you can see that Italian architects, meanwhile, perceive the motorway south of Monza. The facade along the motorway are now better, because they think that the facade is relating to a city and not longer an industrial facade like along a motorway. So this perception is slowly changing, but I would say Swiss architects are really interested on iconic building like this. So not there. Jacques Herzog one mentions they are anti-intellectuals, they are anti-urban, they are only interested to have small, beautiful pieces of architecture, and that's really a cultural problem.
And so who is in charge of the cities today? Because you described this very strong contrast between the perception of the kind of the aristocratic city in the center, where you have the Gioponti, the Gardella, the Terragni, which is the center of Milan, the noble part. And then on the other side you have a big metropolitan area, which is not much smaller than the metropolitan area in London. And who do you think is in charge of this today? Or is no one in charge? Who is and who should be?
It depends, it changes in every country. For instance, we did master planning, the urban master plan after the Olympic in London. So Kees Christianse, as you know, an urban planner, was moderating this process. We are always introduced in London as urban planners, because we are in charge of the landscape. And for British people, it's obvious, then we are the urban planners. And the architects did small pieces in our master plan to check whether it really works, our master plan. But then it's in every country, it's completely different. And it's at ETH, everybody is only interested to go to Mumbai, Singapore, wherever. But I have a problem that most of you have in Italy at least some experience with really urban situation. Our students are mainly coming from villages, how can they understand a city without having lived in a city or really understand a city? And it's, everybody in Switzerland is now saying we should be more in charge. But when I ask you, who is responsible to design a street? So I mean, from facade to facade, you have urban planner, architects, traffic planners, light engineering, landscape architects. They are all responsible, but nobody is responsible for the real design, and that's today a problem. And I think in the future, I would like it would come back to the architect, really, the architect in the old sense, not having all this discipline, urban planning and urban designers and landscape architects and landscape designers. And so we have all these different disciplines, but nobody's really responsible. And finally, I think that's why we are teaching architects, landscape architects, that they are able to discuss it from a different point of view, that they have this ability to discuss it or start from a different point. And I think that's important. I always engage my students. You have to criticize all, for instance, the landscape architects, if they show you all, all these over-designed parks all over the world, meanwhile, you should criticize, but it's not so easy for an architect to understand what is it, if it's only on a drawing. That's why we are working with models, so even normal people, not only architects, can understand what we are doing, and it's about communication. And I think I try to establish landscape architecture in the discipline of architecture. And if it's going like it's going now, I would say this in future, I know all this in Italy, in many Mediterranean countries, landscape architecture was founded at the universities in the last decades. But personally, I think it will come back to the architects. They don't have to know all the different trees and so on, but as a discipline, they are much stronger. In my perception, they are much stronger than the discipline of landscape architects. And I could teach worldwide, or at least in the Western world, they can't find really people who are not afraid against architectural students, so really are interested what they are saying, or CTH Studio Basel, for instance, with the research, they did everything, sociology, landscape, urbanization, and it's agriculture. And that's interesting if architects really think about the whole and not only the specific buildings. And I think that's the future, and I don't know why, but the number of students in landscape architecture is going down like that. The demand is still going up like that. Even in the United States, Harvard, everywhere, they really have problems. They don't have enough students. When you don't have enough students, you don't have enough good students. But you get much more money as a landscape architect after your master's than as an architect. But nobody knows why you are not interested in landscape.
I have one last question. Then I have nothing else to ask. You mentioned Aldo Rossi before, who in Milan is a bit of a taboo now. It seems that there are very few sort of publications, or I don't know how many of the students, the students who are 20 years old know about Aldo Rossi. But that's not so important. I think what is important is to understand that until about 30 years ago, architects were very aware that their job also had political implications, and that there were different ways of design according to one's political beliefs, or to at least to the desires of the local political administration. Architecture and urbanism especially had strong political meanings. Do you think that urban design rather than landscape designs have a relationship to politics, or they are today apolitical?
Yeah, especially in Switzerland, it's meanwhile very political. But when I mention Aldo Rossi were for the ETH and for Switzerland super important because he, for instance, Jacques Herzog and Pierre de Meuron, this generation of architects started with Lucius Burckhardt. He was a sociologist. They didn't design anything. They only wrote text. 1968. They only wrote text. It was super political. And then their diploma they did with Aldo Rossi in 1973. And he came and said, guys, you have to design buildings, you have to think about city. But what he really brought in was this idea of an urban understanding of architecture. That was new and, of course, very political. And I think it can be influential, but nowadays we have to explain students what is really political then, and then to have a statement, to have an attitude towards the own work, and it has to become more political. But when I see all these young, really talented students afterwards working in commercial offices in Middle East, in China, wherever, it's not so easy to be political when you are confronted with this kind of jobs afterwards. And but it should become again more political.
I don't know if Antonio, Alessandro have questions, or if any of the students would like to ask something.
Yes, I think that was interesting, the last question of Sebastiano about politics, because I was thinking also to the first image of your presentation, was the Mark Tansey view of the cowboys-like people looking towards the Robert Smithson spiral jetty. That was a description, I think, in my opinion, was an idea of representation of a conflict of different worlds that stay together in a strange place, belonging to different cultures, to different countries, different point of views, are like a crossing of point of views that cannot cross in a way, no difference of time and a splitting of different times in the same place. I don't know, a place like that, a play like that. And when I see your Alps border, that is very provocative, in my opinion, very, very strong gesture to imagine the Alps as a nation or as a whole, as something that is independent from the political borders, from the different languages, from the different histories, from different climates. So in that drawing, I think that there is a very strong geophysical definition, but also in potential a very strong geopolitical idea, in a way. Also an aesthetical idea, because a nation is something that has also an aesthetic point of view of in front of the world, in front of the nature, in front of the city, etc. So in some way that for me was very interesting, but I did not understand what is the political enjeu, the question, the political question and the aesthetical question that you see beside this image that is the starting point of a project. It is a projectual image, you know? Can you say something about that, something more?
Yes, the first image, Robert Smithson is talking about geological time, so some million years, and Mark Tansey showing these Indians is talking about the last 200 years. So, and it's but it's the same landscape somehow, and it's I think it's important, especially this land art today. Many people are still saying, yeah, it's land art, but land art stopped when in 1973 when Robert Smithson and Gordon Matta Clark died. So it was a specific art in a specific time, and I think we shouldn't talk today about land art. But there it's really about a culture of the American culture. And here, when I'm talking about the Alps, for me, it's a cultural landscape. That's the most important thing. We should forget, and of course, coming from Switzerland, it's a bit provocative when I say Switzerland is not part of the European Union. It's in the middle of Western Europe, but it's not part of Europe. So when I say we should forget all these administrative borders, but we have the problem that every politician in Switzerland is talking about his village and is not talking about the region. And the same, you have in the Alps, for instance, you have touristic resorts in Italy and Switzerland exploring their own program, but they should connect. That's important. It's easier to discuss between Switzerland and Italy than between one village and the next in Switzerland. And I think it's a cultural landscape, let's say, and we explain it to our students. For instance, when we came 2 weeks ago, we started in the Alps with the alpine food, and I wanted to have it. I want to have polenta and speck and bresaola, all these things. And in Milan, I want to have, and I invite the students, I want risotto al zafferano and ossobuco. To explain, now you had 30 kilometers, it's a completely different culture. Here it's very urban, and there it's very alpine, where you relate in Switzerland, in Austria, it all relates to this kitchen, to this culture, and that they really understand it's a cultural landscape. And before we came here, we showed them in Zurich that in Zurich you eat butter. Then you go to the Alps, you have lardo and speck, and then you come to Milan, and south of Milan it starts olive oil. And why is it like that? It's not only Italian food is nice, and so all these stereotypes. It has to do with the landscape, the idea and the culture of landscape. And I think for me, of course, even my assistants are saying it's very provocative. But I would say it has to, especially Milan, this density you can feel everywhere, this urban density wherever you are. You can be 20 kilometers outside Milan, you feel this strong presence of a center. You don't have it in Switzerland, for instance, where it's very polycentric. It's an advantage and it's a disadvantage, but we have to deal with these different urbanization types. And that's important for me at least to teach and that students understand. And it's not so easy for them to work in Milan. They're really, and Sebastiano, you know, for them, sometimes he has to translate what it means because they see it, but they don't understand. But it's so close to Switzerland, they don't understand what they see. And so we have to translate, and I think that's interesting if we understand an area like the Alps, like a cultural landscape. And so what does it mean? So everybody is responsible then, not only architects or landscape architects.
We have a cultural question. Oh, everyone is hungry now that we mentioned some good recipes.
No, your lecture is full of suggestions, but when I think of Aldo Rossi in Switzerland, I think also the study on the rural architecture, especially some wonderful issue on the rural architecture in Canton Ticino. And I think it's interesting because this part of the research of Aldo Rossi is not so known, especially I think by the young generation. And I wondered because at the same time, or some time after, but not so many years after the architecture of the city, the studies was devoted to recover the Hunziker studies. So the old geographers in Italy, we had others like Baraggiolo and others, but studies that join culture, site, house, construction of the landscape, and geology also. Deep geology of the site. So the question is, how you can recover, or if you think that this connection between culture and deep geology of the site is important. Because the other thing that was for me a strong suggestion is the Plan of London. Just to explain a project you start, or I don't know, but you put in any image, 5 images. One is the geological plan of the city. So, at last, is the geology political?
Yes, I think you can think it political, and then perhaps I have to explain when. So we are with all our students, these are about 70, 80 in 3 different groups. One is working along the river Lambro from the Alps to the Po. One is group is working on the Parco delle Gruane, and one is working on what we have as a frame, urban food, how to feed a city and to understand the city. It's not only because you have the World Expo next year, but we did it in London, we did it in Switzerland, and then we are talking about logistics. And why is it like, and then it's really geology. Because when you have this food, especially in Switzerland, it's completely related to logistics, to production condition, with climate, geology, all these things. And it's completely different in East or Western Switzerland. And to explain to students how to feed a city, it's not only that farmers have to produce food, but how is it related, let's say 100 years ago, the animals were brought into the city center, slaughtered in the city center. Today, it's on the edge of the city, no longer in the city center. So how does it change this perception and understanding of a culture? And it relates directly to architecture, finally. And all these things, you can read it very directly in relation to architecture, especially geology. Can you imagine, so why are building costs in the city center of London so expensive? One reason is the concrete is so expensive. You know, you have 1 lorry in the morning, 1 lorry in the afternoon. The same lorry would in Zurich do at least 6 or 7 lorries a day. So that makes it so expensive, and you don't have space, and this distance to the production sites, it makes it so expensive. That's completely different, and they have to find gravel pits, and it's not so easy to find close to London. Of course, you could find it outside, but then you have 1 lorry in 2 days. So and there it's becoming really political. But for me, it's to see the liberal market in London showing that you really need, on the government side, somebody who is really taking responsibility, who is helping the professional urban planners, landscape architects or architects. Saying we need these people working for the government, explaining what the local people are interested in, what are the processes going on in relation not only to our project, but in relation to the whole city. And that's what we are missing and, or losing in the last decade, even in Switzerland, where it's very well organized, it's very democratic, but it's like when we are working now for the 2nd stage of the Tate, all investments around there for £5 billion in real estate investments, only because of this museum. And I know somebody who had an apartment in this building just near the Tate to the River Thames. It was social housing. So Margaret Thatcher said, oh, you have to buy it because, you know, we want that people own their apartment. So this guy bought it in mid-80s for close to nothing, and he sold it, and he could buy a farm, a really huge farm in Wales. It's amazing. If it's becoming so, this monopoly, this hypercritical capitalism, and people living there, it's just not possible. I don't know how my people working in the London office can survive. They can, first of all, they can never buy this quality of food you all have for normal here in Milan or in Zurich. Very good biological food from the farmers market. It's too expensive for my people. So that's why they are interested in urban farming projects. Some of the students proposed it here as well. But in London, you really have to be in a club producing on the roofs your own vegetables, because otherwise you cannot afford to buy this quality of vegetables. That's real, and then it's becoming super political, I think.
Well, I think that we finished, I think, also on a certain polemics, because I think that you know, we have anticipated, or Guenther has anticipated problems which your generation will see in a much more obvious way. And this will probably affect everyone's lifestyle. And I don't think it has anything to do with ecology directly. It's more something to do with really, you know, with something more, it's deeper in a way. It doesn't only have to do with the consumption of energy. It's something which affects our lifestyle and the shape of our cities as well. So I think we can finish our evening now and go and have some food. Okay, bye, thanks.